Massimo Pigliucci is an author, blogger, podcaster, as well as the K.D. Irani Professor of Philosophy at the City College of New York. His academic work is in evolutionary biology, philosophy of science, the nature of pseudoscience, nonsense on stilts, and practical philosophy. Massimo publishes a regular column in philosophy, now entitled The Art of Living. His books include How to Be a Stoic, Using Ancient Philosophy to Live a Modern Life. One of my favorites, Nonsense on Stilts, How to Tell Science from Bunk, and your new book, Beyond Stoicism, A Guide to the Good Life with Stoics, Skeptics, Epicureans, and other ancient philosophers. And he's also editor of this book, which later this afternoon, our new members during the orientation are going to get a copy, and which also includes a chapter on ethical culture. But we're going to focus on Stoicism. Okay. I have water. Yep, that works. Great. Well, first of all, why don't we let folks know how we met each other? I was the clergy leader at the New York Society, and you came in through mutual acquaintances and friends and members, and we realized that you had great gifts, and so we decided to take advantage of them. And you offered—
That's one way to put it, yeah.
A very popular course on Stoicism.
Yes,
so
right.
Please tell us some more about that experience.
Yeah, we actually started with a colleague of mine who is one of the co-authors, Sky Cleary, a series of conversations at Ethical Manhattan, and it went incredibly well. I mean, it lasted for a long time. There were lots of people coming, so it was a really exciting program. It was really difficult to imagine for me that people would want to come out on, an evening where there are lots of other things to do in New York, and just participate very actively in a conversation about philosophy and way of life. So yeah, that was a great experience.
I think what resonated, certainly with our members, was how like ethical culture Stoicism is.
Yeah.
And I think there are many misconceptions about Stoicism. We will refer to somebody sometimes as a pejorative and say, oh,
That's right.
He's Stoic. He's Stoic. And yet, as you mentioned in your essay here, some Stoic philosophers actually encourage us to have a glass of wine now and again.
That's right, so long as you don't get drunk.
Oh, no, I think one of them said a little intoxication.
A little intoxication is okay, according to Seneca at least.
Yeah, so how do you address the people who think they know what it is? And
Well, I thought myself, before getting into Stoicism, that a Stoic was somebody like Mr. Spock from Star Trek. With all due respect to Spock, one of my favorite characters, but I wouldn't want to live a life like that one. In other words, stiff upper lip, suppression of emotions, that kind of stuff. And that is the meaning of the modern term Stoic with a little s. But Stoic with a big S, meaning the philosophy, as opposed to that stiff upper lip attitude, is actually quite a different thing. Yes, it is about endurance. Mm-hmm. To some extent, that's where the stiff upper lip comes from. One of the Stoic values certainly is endurance. If you cannot do anything about a particular situation, then you just need to endure it. There's, the only choices you have are either to endure or to throw a tantrum, and presumably as an adult human being, you don't want to throw a tantrum. There is also something about the emotion stuff, because the Stoics, they did not counsel to suppress emotion, which incidentally, it's impossible. You can't. Any psychologist would tell you that you cannot suppress your emotions anyway. You can modulate them. You can deal with them. You can literally talk to them, but you cannot suppress them. But what the Stoics did was to separate emotions into two broad categories. One category is what they refer to as the healthy emotions. These are the kinds of things you want to cultivate, and they include emotions like love for your children, for your partner, for an idea, if it is a good idea, a positive idea, that sort of stuff. Love for justice, that's another one. A sense of justice is a positive emotion according to the Stoics, and so on. But then there are also unhealthy emotions, which are natural. You have them, you cannot suppress them, but you need to deal with them. You need to somehow come to terms with them. And those involve things like hatred, xenophobia, and even anger. For the Stoics, anger is not a good thing, even when it's justified. When it's natural for the Stoics to be angry in response to an injustice that either you received or somebody you loved received, but to act on the basis of that anger is considered unwise, because you tend to overreact, you tend to do things in a way it's not conducive to justice at the end of the day.
In your introduction to this, what you call a sampler of different philosophies,
right.
You refer, and this really struck me, that this was transformative, that when you learned about Stoicism, there was something very transformative about this. So I wanted to the degree that you're comfortable sharing that with us, because you obviously are still a scientist,
Yep.
And you were teaching science, and then what happened?
Well, what happened was a midlife crisis that came a little bit earlier than average, but it still comes to most people. Interestingly, the statistics are that women go through a midlife crisis about a decade after men. I don't know why exactly. Nobody knows why, but it's a thing. So there wasn't anything particularly extraordinary. A divorce that I did not expect, my father dying, and some major changes in my career. All of that happened in the span of a few months. So now any psychologist would tell you that one of those things is stressful. 3 or 4 within a short period of time, they really can do some work on you. And so when that was happening, while that was happening, I thought, okay, let me reach out to what I thought was my philosophy of life at the time, which was psychohumanism. Because I left the Catholic Church when I was a teenager, and ever since then, I consider myself a psychohumanist. Now, I still think psychohumanism is a great idea, support for universal human rights, use of reason and science, and all that sort of stuff. But when it came to deal with that kind of situation, I really didn't see practical tools, right? I didn't see anything that I could actually grab on and say, all right, let me help. This is going to help me make sense of things. So I embarked in a little bit of a quest. So I started systematically studying a number of practical philosophies of life. I started with Buddhism. And then I moved on to some of the Greco-Roman philosophies, beginning with Aristotle and then Epicurus. All of these were very interesting. All of these had something to contribute to my understanding of what was going on, but none of them really clicked. Then one day, on what at the time was called Twitter, now called X, I saw this tweet, and it said, "Help us celebrate Stoic Week." And I thought, what the hell is Stoic Week, and why would anybody want to celebrate the Stoics? Because at the time, again, I thought of the Stoics as, Mr. Spock. Then I thought about it for a moment. I said, hold on a second. Stoicism was also a type of virtue ethics, so it's in the same general category of Aristotle, Epicurus, and so on and so forth. So like, okay, that sounds interesting, actually. Then I remember when I was in college, I read Marcus Aurelius, the Meditations. Turns out he was a Stoic. When I was in high school, I translated Seneca from Latin. Turns out he was a Stoic, although I didn't put the two together at all at the time. So I thought, okay, maybe I should be looking into this thing. And the first thing that I did was I downloaded a book by a guy named Epictetus, who I knew nothing about at that time, even though I had taken graduate level courses in ancient philosophy, never heard of Epictetus. Turned out he was a Stoic, an early 2nd century Stoic. He started his life as a slave, and then he became arguably the most sought after teacher in the Mediterranean area at the time. And he really, I heard the click in the back of my mind. Right? It's like as soon as I started reading Epictetus, here's this guy who has had an incredible life. He talks absolutely in an accessible way, no nonsense kind of stuff. He has a wicked sense of humor that borders on sarcasm. He talks to his students in a way that really resonates clearly with young people. And so I thought, okay, I have to have more of this. And here we are, more than a decade later.
You took a deep dive.
I took a
you got
definitely
a
deep
doctorate
dive.
in it.
Yep, yes. I was working at the same time in my PhD in philosophy. That was for professional reasons. I wanted to move from evolutionary biology to philosophy of science. But at the same time, about the same time, this kind of stuff happened. And so it's like, that was useful, that was convenient. I had resources that available to me. I could go to professors and say, hey, how come I never heard about Epictetus? And they would say, oh, let me tell you about it. So.
And then another gift that you give is that since you went through this personal transformation, I imagine you wondered what other people are thinking and what other people are doing. And so you worked on this. And again, from your introduction, I love this. A philosophy of life is a framework that is made at a minimum of metaphysics, that is, an account of how the world works, and an ethics, that is, a set of principles or guidelines to deploy when interacting with others. And the real question then is not whether you have a philosophy of life, but rather if it stands up to scrutiny, if it's a good philosophy of life. And so you gathered different folks and asked them to contribute
including
to this
you.
sampler, including me, right? But what I really love about that is, and just a quick personal anecdote, my son was going to major in philosophy at the University of Rochester. He gets there and he says, Mom, it's all about logic. He said, that's not what I thought philosophy was.
Right.
He said, so he switched his major to religion because he thought that was more of a meaning making that he could at least grapple with at the university rather than pure logic. Yep. So is that your experience now? Is philosophy academically still kind of in the logic and linguistics and everything? Or does it also have some kind of a balance that includes ethics? I would hope so.
Yeah, unfortunately, your son's experience is not unusual. However, things are changing slowly. So the reason I never heard about Epictetus until I got into Stoicism is not because he was unknown. He was actually a household name up until the 19th century. All of the so-called founding fathers of the American Revolution, from Washington to Jefferson to various others, all of them had a copy of Epictetus in their libraries, and they write about it, they comment on it. So Epictetus was very well known up until fairly recently. And then the 20th century comes, philosophy becomes a very specialized field of inquiry, an academic field of inquiry. It becomes esoteric. It becomes a language that very few people can understand. And it becomes its own self-regarding thing. Now, there's not necessarily anything wrong with becoming an academic field. That happened to other fields, right? Science, evolutionary biology, my own field. They're all like that. But the trade-off was that philosophy lost that kind of general broad appeal, philosophy as a way to figure out what you want to do in life as opposed to just studying logic. Now, that said, let me tell a little story. So Epictetus, in the Discourses, has one of his students, perhaps somebody like your son, coming up to him and say, oh, come on, do I have to study logic? And Epictetus responds, well, would you like me to provide you with an argument for why logic is important to be understood? And the student says, yes, please, absolutely. Epictetus looks at the student and says, well, but if you don't know logic, how would you know that my argument is a good one? And the student said, oh, right. So there is something to be said for the study of logic. But for the study of logic for logic's sake, for its own sake, without any actual application to the real world, that is the kind of stuff that Epictetus would definitely object to.
And that leads us into your essay on Stoicism, where you say there are two crucial ideas underlying Stoicism, and they each correspond to one major promise the philosophy holds for its practitioners. And I love that you're practicing it, right? Yep. That's Felix Adler started Ethical Culture. He said it's a practical religion. If you don't put it to use,
it's
just
useless.
put it up on it's useless. Yeah,
it's not.
The first crucial idea is that life is fundamentally about being a morally good person, which is achieved through the continuous practice of 4 cardinal virtues, which I'm sure you're going to get into. Yeah. The second idea is the so-called dichotomy of control. You alluded to that a little bit earlier, the notion that some things are up to us, as the Stoics say, and other things are not. And I think also underlying that is that you have to be able to have discernment and some logic and some understanding to be able to make that distinction.
Correct.
Yeah.
So one of the problems with modern contemporary philosophy is that ethics itself has become a highly specialized discipline where people spend a lot of time and write very nice and sophisticated works on, on what is right and what is wrong, but then they don't practice it. They don't put it into practice. In fact, there was a series of studies a few years ago that came out where they investigated whether moral philosophers are more ethical than your average academic. You would think, right? I mean, you would think that, for instance, I don't know, a mathematician is better in numbers than or keeping, let's say, his or her budget at home than a non-mathematician. Well, it turns out moral philosophers, this was measured by a number of things, like, do they return their books to the library? Do they write to their mom? Do they do their work as they're supposed to do, and so on and so forth. And it turns out that no, there is no difference between an average moral philosopher and an average academic. In other words, studying, being even a world expert on moral philosophy doesn't seem to make you a better person. And Epictetus would have said, then what the hell are you doing it for? Right? What is it what are you doing here? Step back for a moment and ask yourself, what is the point of this? Ethics, the word ethics comes from the Greek, ethikos, which means character. So for the ancient Greeks, ethics was about improving your character, becoming a better person. It wasn't necessarily about determining whether each particular action is right or wrong. That you're going to do as a byproduct of the fact that you're trying to be a better person. If you are a good person, then you have an understanding of the kinds of things you should be doing or not doing. The word ethics, ethikos, was then translated into Latin by Marcus Tullius Cicero, who was one of the major Roman philosophers. And since there was no equivalent word in the Latin for ethics, it came up with moralis, from which our morality comes from. Moralis means mores, means the habits of a society. So if you combine those two, ethics is about developing your character and interacting properly with other people within your community. That is what ethics is about. In modern moral philosophy, it has become the abstract study of the criteria according to which a particular action is right or wrong. And so we kind of lost touch of the original meaning, which I think was much more useful.
And following up on that a bit, in the way that ethics is used today, different institutions like hospitals, health institutions will have maybe an ethics code of ethics or an ethics board. My sense of that is that a lot of that is to address potential legal issues.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Ethics has become a legalistic kind of, very often when we teach, for instance, at City College, business ethics, which some people might think it's an oxymoron. But why do we teach them that? Well, from our perspective, it's because we want people going to business programs to actually and eventually become, high-level, CEOs or whatever, to act ethically. But that's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is that they're going to be aware of the specific regulations and norms and so on and so forth, and they're going to find ways around them. So ethics becomes, a legalistic kind of thing as opposed to something you actually live and actually you practice in your daily life.
So following up on that, I'm going to delve a little bit into our contemporary life here, because some of what we're dealing with, looking at, observing, commenting about what's happening in Washington, D.C., for example.
Just an example at random.
Just an example.
Yes.
Is exactly that, a more legalistic perspective of ethics. But even there, it's like, what can we get away with? And so they refer to it as transactional ethics. I think that's an oxymoron.
That definitely is an oxymoron.
I'm wondering what, and I know it might be a deep dive, but it's certainly lively for us right now. What is your sense as you're reading, experiencing, thinking about all this in terms of?
Well, one thing that comes to mind in looking at the current situation, without becoming, getting too much into the nuts and bolts of the ongoing politics. I'm sure we all have our ideas. I'm pretty sure we probably would agree broadly on what's happening. But given that as a background, one of the things that I'm reminded of actually is the time of Cicero. Cicero lived at the end of the Roman Republic, about 2,000 years ago. He was a contemporary of Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and all those people. And he thought that things were unraveling very quickly at one point. And they were unraveling not because the laws were not good, but because the people were not good. Because the people had started violating the law and then rationalizing why they were doing so. And Cicero at some point said that you can have the best system you want. And at the time, the Roman Republic was the best system on the market, so to speak. It was a democracy. We tend to think of ancient democracy as the Athenian one. But Athenian democracy was really a majority rule kind of thing. So Socrates, you heard a quote from Socrates before. Socrates was killed by the Athenian assembly by a simple majority vote, right? So they got together and it's like, 270 against and whatever it is, and then we're done, he's dead. That was a democracy in the sense of people were voting on things, but there were no checks and balances, there was no constitution, there was nothing that we normally associate with different branches of government and that sort of stuff. The Roman Republic had all of that. The tribunes, who were the major officers carrying out the day-to-day work of the Republic, were elected. The consuls, there were two consuls, were essentially co-presidents, as by our standards today. They were elected, and they had term limits. They couldn't stay in office more than a year, and they couldn't run twice consecutively. There was a constitution, there were checks and balances, there was a Senate on the one hand that had certain powers over the tribunes, and vice versa, the tribunes had some powers over the Senate. All of that had been working beautifully for close to 500 years by the time Cicero comes around. But then what happens? One person, Julius Caesar, decides that he's just gonna ignore the law and see if he can get away with it, right? So when he famously said, we still hear, because of Shakespeare, we still have this phrase, the die is cast. Yeah. He said that when he was crossing the Rubicon River in northern Italy. The Rubicon River was the official border between Rome and the rest of Europe. If you crossed that, anybody who crossed that point with an army was declaring war to the Senate and therefore to the people of Rome. And that's exactly what Caesar did. Instead of decommissioning his army after he was done with his job, he crossed with one legion, thereby declaring war. That had never happened before, right? And he thought this was the right thing to do. He had his own rationalizations. That was the beginning of the end, because once somebody in that kind of high-level position starts ignoring the law and gets away with it, that's it.
It was unprecedented.
It was unprecedented. That's right.
Yes, yeah. And Cicero and others showed great courage, which brings us back to the four cardinal virtues,
right,
which are practical wisdom, the ability to navigate complex situations, especially the morally salient ones, in the best way possible, courage of the moral kind, as in the courage to stand up and do the right thing, justice, meaning treating others as worthy of the respect and dignity that comes with being fellow humans, and temperance, responding to situations in just measure without excess or defect. And I think that's what we see at play right now, don't we? I think that is that flashpoint in history is so relevant today.
Yes, so the four cardinal virtues are called cardinal for a reason. They're like the cardinal points. They're points of reference, right? They're not the only four virtues that the ancients or even the Stoics specifically recognized. They had a number of others in mind, but those were cardinal because the idea was that you can use these as a compass to navigate life. Basically, whatever you're doing, you ask yourself, well, is this wise? Is it courageous? Is it just? And is it temperate? And if the answer is no to any of those, then you're not doing it. Now, part of what is happening today, and that's why there is I brought up the analogy with what was happening in the Roman Republic, is that there is no longer, if there ever was, I mean, we can have that discussion, but there certainly is no longer much of a emphasis on character, right? We just seem to expect at this point that our leaders and politicians are going to do whatever they think is best for their own fraction of people who follows them. So it's become a war, an internal war, not literally a war, but an internal conflict where character is no longer something that, I mean, current politicians in the United States, you know who I'm talking about, are getting away with things that just 10 years ago or less were unthinkable. Right? If anybody had done or said anything like what's going on right now, they would have been immediately out. I cannot imagine Mitt Romney saying a fraction of what the current some of the current politicians are saying, and not being immediately booted out of the party, that sort of stuff. So something has changed, and something has changed fairly dramatically, fairly quickly. And I suspect, again, on the basis of the example of the Roman Republic and others throughout history, that what has happened is that somebody decided to test the system and say, well, how much can I get away with? If I don't follow the rules? And apparently the answer, at least at the moment, is a lot.
A lot, yeah. Another important issue, you heard that Nancy mentioned one of her joys was marching yesterday, and I know that you were with Ellen and with Bill. So obviously, climate, and of course, we're dedicating this whole month to climate justice. So how can Stoicism help to maybe ground us even more in terms of how we approach this in a moral and ethical way? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that the major thing that is helpful, not just from Stoicism, but in general from the virtue ethical tradition, which, by the way, it's not just a Greco-Roman thing. People have suggested that virtue ethics, meaning an ethics that the emphasis of which is on character rather than rules and things like that, that also in the Eastern traditions, for instance, that Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism can be understood, or can be rephrased at least, as kinds of virtue ethics. But the best understood examples are from the Greco-Roman tradition. One of the things that that tradition can do is to shift the emphasis. We live in a society where the emphasis is on outcomes, on results. And unfortunately, outcomes are not under our control. We can't really determine outcomes. We can contribute to things, obviously. We can do our best to influence things in a certain way, but ultimately, the outcome of our actions does not depend on us, because it depends on a bunch of other factors, including the actions of a lot of other people, and a lot of other actors that are part of the conversation, or sometimes part of the problem. So too much emphasis on results risks burning people up, right? Because it engenders, at some point, if you don't get enough results, or if you don't get results that are tangible and more or less immediate, eventually you yield to desperation. Because eventually this is just a psychological thing. If you keep doing things and you get no results, then you're going to give up. And the last thing you want to do is to give up. But the problem is that psychologically that comes pretty natural. So what Stoicism and virtue ethics in general do is they help us shift the framework from the outcome of the actions, which we don't control, to our intentions and efforts, which we do control. Those are entirely up to us. When Epictetus says some things are up to us and other things are not up to us, he then goes on. This is at the beginning of a small little book called the Enchiridion, which means the manual for a good life. And he goes on and actually explains what is up to us and what is not up to us. And he says, up to us, there's only three things. Our considered judgments, so the decisions we make, the assessments we make of a certain situation, explicitly, not implicitly or not subconsciously, as we would say today. But when you sit down and you think about something, you make a decision. The decisions to act or not to act on those judgments, right? Once you have a judgment, then you decide, well, what am I going to do with this thing? And to a certain extent, the evaluation of your own values and priorities and goals. Right? So some of our values that kind of come to us without much reflection, they're pre-reflective, as philosophers say. That is, we just inherit them automatically from our upbringing and so on and so forth. But you can also stop and think about them and say, okay, what are my values here? What is it that I actually think it's important or not important? Those three things, judgments, decisions to act or not to act, and values, are entirely up to us. Epictetus says nobody can force you to change your mind about those things. Even when we say, we often we say things like, well, I couldn't help it because somebody was pointing a gun to my head. According to Epictetus, yes, you can help it, even if somebody points a gun to your head. He actually has an example with one of his students. One of his students says, but, the emperor could put me in jail. And Epictetus says, no, it can put your body in jail, but your mind remains free. And the student is not convinced, so he says, well, but he can behead me. He can kill me. And Epictetus says, and who told you were immortal? It's still your decision whether you're going to do what the emperor wants or not. Sure, sometimes that decision is going to cost you your life, and hopefully you're not going to get to that point. You're not have to that, but that's no excuse. Your decision is still yours. Now, by contrast, everything else, including your health, the outcome of your actions, your wealth, your education, also all sorts of other things, is not up to you, according to Epictetus, in the sense that you can do your best, but the final outcome is not under your control. Take health, for instance, which most of us think that it's under our control, right? I mean, I can go to the gym, I can eat a healthy diet, I can go to the doctor on a regular basis, blah, blah. Yeah, and then a tiny little virus comes in and kills me. The final outcome is not up to me. I can do certain things, but if you think about it, those things are the results of my judgments and my decisions to act or not to act. I don't actually control whether those decisions are going to lead to the outcome that I want or not. So back to climate change. If we try to switch perspective that way, then it turns out that you succeed when you do the right thing, when you try to do the right thing, not whether you accomplish the right thing or not. Whether you accomplish it, it's not up to you. It's up to a bunch of other things. But nothing is going to happen if you don't actually try to do the right thing. So you win, so to speak, every time you decide to do the right thing, every time that you act on your principles, on your goals, and so on and so forth, regardless of whether you actually win in the outside world or not. Think of it this way. Imagine an athlete, let's say a tennis player. We are, of course, typically we think that a good tennis player is one who wins. But according to Epictetus, a good tennis player is one who plays well. Whether he wins or not depends on other things, including, of course, their opponent, but also, the conditions on the pavement, the weather, the referee, all sorts of other stuff that it's not under their control. The goal of the tennis player should not be to win; it should be to play the best game that they can, and they should train themselves to be happy having done that. Whether they win or not, if you win, it's a plus. But if you win or not, it's not actually something that should affect your self-regard, your happiness, your determination to do things or not. I think that's a very important lesson because it completely shifts around our normal way of thinking about stuff.
We are going to go to Q&A, but my last question for you, not so much a question, as I love it in here, you've got a powerful tool of the Stoic tradition is to have a series of pithy phrases ready. And I love that, you have to have different tools in your toolkit. And I think, again, that's why Stoicism offers us these practical tools. So you listed your favorite ones. Why don't you do the job of a human being? Just tell a little bit why is that one of your favorites?
That comes from Marcus Aurelius. Now, Marcus Aurelius was an emperor, right? Talk about somebody who has power. And yet, of course, even his power was limited. There were things that he tried to accomplish and failed to accomplish. But he chides himself in the Meditations. The Meditations is essentially a book of self-reflection. It was not meant for publication at all. In fact, when it came out originally, many centuries ago, it was not called the Meditations, it was called To Himself, because it was essentially a personal diary of reflection. And in that diary, he often says something along those lines. He says, wake up, just do the right thing. Just the work of a human being is the work of somebody who tries to be helpful to the cosmopolis. The Stoics were cosmopolitan, meaning that they thought that everyone on earth is our brother and sister, or whatever other relationship you want to think that you have with other people. And to do the job of a human being is to act accordingly, whether you succeed or not.
The next one is, the obstacle is the way.
Right. The obstacle is the way. That's also Marcus Aurelius. Again, he knew something about obstacles. The guy had a really interesting and difficult reign. He was, during his period as an emperor, there were two frontier wars. There were two different situations where other people were trying to come into the Roman Empire from the east and from the north. He had major floods that almost destroyed half of Rome. He had a major earthquake that destroyed modern Izmir in Turkey, and he had to deal with that. He suffered through the Antonine Plague, which was an epidemic that killed 5 million people in the Roman Empire. So it was the largest epidemic of antiquity. And he had to deal with an internal revolt. So somebody tried to kill him and become emperor. So he had his hands full. And yet, he kept saying to himself things like, the obstacle is the way, meaning what? Sometimes we face obstacles and all we can do is to just keep banging our head against that wall, instead of considering alternatives. Perhaps you can get around it or above it or below it. Perhaps the wall is actually not a wall at all. If you look at it from a different perspective, it becomes something you can use to do things in a different way. That's actually a Taoist concept. And one of the standard Taoist stories is of this guy whose land was faced with a major flood. And so everybody was telling him, you should build walls to stop the water and all that sort of stuff. And he said, no, that's not going to happen. The water isn't going to be stopped. What I can do instead is to dig canals so that the water, not only it's not going to destroy my land, but it's actually going to irrigate it. It's actually going to be doing good to it. That is one way of transforming the obstacle into a new way.
I'll leave the other tools up to you when you read his essay, but I'll just give you a little teaser. The next one is, it seems so to him. The next is, everything has two handles. And then, there goes my cup. So those are things for you to read later.